Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank a number of people who have been significant in the construction of this center and this institute. Professor Dr. Ali Sheikh Ahmed, former president of the University of Mogadishu. In our world, in Somalia, among other places, very few leaders leave their jobs while they are still young and healthy. And Dr. Ali has been a role model for many of us by starting the university with the help of a lot of good people, both inside and outside the country, but also passing the baton when it was time for him to do other things. So please give him a hand. The second thing I would like to note about Dr. Ali is that there is a gentleman who in New York City, since I live in America, I sometimes use American examples, in New York City who was called Robert Moses. He was an institution embodiment of a kind. Replanned the city of New York itself, built a lot of infrastructure in that state, and then left the place and did other things. Ali for us is the Robert Moses of Mogadishu and Somalia. So thank you, Dr. Ali, for all of your work. Another person I would like to note here is Professor Ibrahim, who is now the current rector of Mogadishu University. Both Ibrahim and Dr. Ali are good friends of mine, so I have dubbed them Al-Ajuz Al-Akbar wal-Ajuz Al-Awsad, you know, out of respect for the quality of their leadership and the kindness of their heart. Thank you both. I also want to acknowledge the supporters and the sponsors of this event, many of them Somali institutions and others. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing excellent work in supporting Dr. Ali. And finally, to the people and the government of Turkey, who have been genuine partners for Somalis and whose empathy has opened many gates for all of us as the Somali people. So without your assistance, I think we'll be struggling in a harder place than we are currently. So thank you to the Turkish people and the government of Turkey. Now, let me say just a few things about what I'm going to talk about. There are 4 parts to the discussion I will present today. So let me give you an outline of that. The first part provides a framework, an analytical framework of how the economy and the politics of the continent works or doesn't work. Without a framework, it becomes an ordinary conversation and usually doesn't take you anywhere. And as a famous British scholar noted, without research, there is no future. So research cannot be done without concepts and ideas that are foundation for the ways in which you organize objects. So theory is terribly important, and a framework is therefore necessary. The second is I will try to define the nature of the African development problem. What exactly is it? Thirdly, I will then look at the resources Africa has. And then finally, I will offer some tentative potential strategy of using those resources to overcome the calamity that has been our continent for too many years. So, I need to stand out, but I need a microphone at the same time. So, is there a microphone that's movable? Hallelujah. So I can do this now. Okay. Framing Africa's development. So there's 2 sides to the issue. One is what I call development, and the other side of development is underdevelopment, the lack of that development. And so what's the genealogy? Somalis are well known for knowing their Abtirsin, or genealogy. Every living thing or a social institution has a genealogy. Okay? The room we are sitting in has a genealogy. Where did the bricks come from? Where did the cement come from? And so on and so forth. So what's the genealogy of the calamity that's the African development? So I'll suggest that there are originally, there are two kinds. So my apologies for, okay. First is what I will call modern Africa's economy has been structured by something called colonial capitalism. What exactly is that? It's the way in which African societies were reorganized by the calamity that was European colonialism. Second, Africa has become independent, and many people call it its yet uhuru, as former president of Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta, said. And so post-colonial capitalism, in many ways, exacerbated the problems that were inherited from the colonial past. And I will say more about those things. And during that second stage here, my thing doesn't show up because it's light, okay? Is that the post-independence, there were two strategies. The first one was one which was state-guided. So many African governments were in the business of production and consumption, planning the economy, if you like, okay? Then second stage came around the tail end of the 1970s, which is now what's commonly called in Europe neoliberalism, or structural adjustment. Thank you. That's easier. Can you hear it? Okay. So neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, by and large, there was an attempt by the World Bank in the late 80s, early 90s, to look around Africa after they have invested billions of dollars over a period of 30 years to look for successful projects in the continent which they have invested over the previous 30 years. Usually as a school teacher or a professor, when you teach students, the failures should be very few and the successes should be many. And here, what the bank was doing, going all around Africa, is to look for any successful projects they have invested because there were too many failures. Exactly the converse of the project of education. So this neoliberal project number B, if you like, is now coming to its tail end. It has come to the ground. It can no longer function. So the debate currently as we speak is, what's the next strategy for Africa? And they have been talking about something called the notion of social contracts. I'll be attending a conference in Washington middle of next month, which is going to talk about that. And I sense that it's deja vu all over again. That's to say that it's just rejigging the old system without actually restructuring the power relationships that produce either poverty or wealth in our continent. So I'll speak about those very briefly. So let me say a few things then about the conceptual clarity, because conceptual clarity, as I said, is very, very vital. How do you know what you see is actually what it is? How do you know what you see is what it is? And so clarity is important if we are going to have an action plan to solve the problems. So think of the 5 blind people who saw an elephant. They were blind, they couldn't see the elephant, so everybody touched one side of the elephant. The people who touched the tail of the elephant thought it was a rope. The people who touched the trunk, the leg, thought it was a tree trunk. The people who touched the ear of the elephant thought it was some softy spot. But nobody could see the elephant because they were all blind, right? So we can talk little bits and parts of it, and then you see the whole conceptually, then you will know how the system works together like an engineer. Okay? So there's a gentleman who just passed away this year actually, a famous African who worked in Dakar, Senegal for almost 40 years, from Egypt, by the name Samir Amin. He wrote a number of books over the years. I think he should have been a Nobel Prize winner for economics, but that didn't happen because he was a left-winger, and left-wingers usually don't get that kind of thing. Okay. Amin wrote a piece which I still, to this day, use in my undergraduate classes in the University of Minnesota. And he identified 2 kinds of economies. One is what he calls at the bottom, number A, is articulated economy. I'll say a bit more about that. And then another kind is a disarticulated economy. What are these? Okay. An articulated economy has two sectors, okay? Sector number one is what's called the producer sector. Sector number two is what's called the consumer sector. And for an economy to develop, and to be a developed economy, you need to have those two sectors. The first sector does not produce for you and I. It's companies, firms, institutions that produce for other companies. They don't sell it to you and I as ordinary people. They sell it to other companies, okay? And department two is the one that produces coats, shoes, and what have you. They produce for the consumer. And to be an economy that is articulated, you need to have both of those sectors in the same country, in the same territory, okay? What colonial economies did was to do exactly the converse, okay? So this is what we call the machine tool sector, department one, and the consumer sector. And these things need to be wired together to be able to work. Okay, what's a disarticulated economy by contrast? Colonial capitalism was uniquely of a disarticulated kind, okay? And so colonies, by and large, produced what they did not consume and consumed what they did not produce. They produced what they did not consume and consumed what they did not produce. So for instance, Uganda produced cotton forcibly done to them by the British. But that cotton was not processed in Uganda. It was sent to Manchester, England, where it was processed, turned into fabrics, and then it will be sold at a higher price to the Ugandan people. So they will never develop the skills necessary to be able to do those things themselves, okay? So they produced cotton, but they didn't use the cotton. They sent it overseas. They consumed fabrics. They didn't produce the fabrics. It came from outside. And therefore, their people could not get employment. You could not accumulate wealth in the country. And consequently, you will always be dependent on the British or the French or the Americans or whoever else. That's what our disarticulated economy. The nature of education then and skill building in the colonies in Africa, whether it was South Africa or Algeria, whether it was Somalia or Senegal, across the board, it was the same. Nature of education was to maintain the colonial apparatus or structure rather than to transform it. So post-colonial capitalism then, as we suggested, had two actors. One is the economy, the other one is the state. Okay. And so the economy in the post-colonial, 1957, 1956, Sudan and Ghana, when both of those countries became the first Africans to liberate themselves, the state played a significant role in organizing and directing the economy. They didn't own it, but they directed it. Some parts were owned by the state. But despite all the efforts made by Nkrumah, the elephant of Africa, if you like, or the lion of Africa, or Nasser of Egypt, or Nyerere of Tanzania, or Lumumba of Congo, who didn't last long enough, unfortunately, okay? Despite all of their efforts, there were hardly any successful transformations of disarticulated economies into articulated economies. Okay. And so wealth was not created and retained in Africa. Wealth was produced through the primary products they harvested from nature, and that was processed overseas, where much of the value was captured. So let me give you an example for the Somalis in particular. In the 1980s, if you shipped a ton of bananas from the banana-producing regions of the country, and that ton of bananas earned $100, okay? 75% of that went overseas and was captured overseas. Only 25% of the value was captured locally, okay? And the heart of that was child labor, who had absolutely no future in that economy. That's what we are talking about. So the economy almost became degenerative, even worse than the colonies, if you like. This is not to celebrate colonialism, but it became degenerative. In politics, an African fellow from Ghana wrote a book in 1968 called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Born Yet. Okay? And so he had characterized those who managed the state, the politicians, as he said, listen to this, they were senile before they were born. Way asaasiqeen intayna dhalan. Can you imagine that? Way asaasiqeen intayna dhalan. They were senile before they were born. So a dysfunctional economy inherited from the colony, a dysfunctional political sector that's managing that, and the consequence was stagnation and hence the reimposition of policies from overseas in the form of neoliberalism. That's what we have in the first phase. I need to move fast before I catch Professor Afier's wrath. So post-colonial capitalism, phase number 2. Then the World Bank and others, they came in the late 1970s and they said, no, you Africans are not doing very well. Here's your new policy. And it was more disaster than previously. Okay? So let me give you a sense of education, for instance, since many of us are educators here. They said governments should not be investing in higher education. The Koreans were exactly doing the converse. The Japanese were doing the converse. The Chinese were doing the converse. You should invest only in primary education. 15 years later, they met with the chancellors of African universities in Lusaka, Zambia. And they said, oops, we don't have enough skilled people at the higher levels. Who was responsible for that? To pull the plug from investments in higher education and in technical education. That's what neoliberalism was and is to this day. Okay. And so the 54 countries in Africa, all of them doing their own little thing alone, despite the so-called regional blocks, which is nonsense in my books. I'm an academic, I'm not a politician, so I try to speak the truth as it is, regardless, whether you like it or not. Okay? 54 countries. We have regional blocks, we have IGAD, we have East African Community, we have on and on and on and on. The only one that's functional is something called SACU in Southern Africa. Not SADC, SACU, the Southern African Customs Union. And we can speak about that at a different time and point. But all of them are maintaining or reproducing the old disarticulated economy that Samir Amin talked about. Neoliberalism, ultimately what it did was, if you like, and I'm going to use a sort of a gender term here, emasculated the African state. It emasculated the African state and literally it turned it into a bogeyman, so to speak. So whatever little progress that was made by the state in restructuring the colonial economy was reversed during the neoliberal project in the 1970s and 80s. Okay? And that retrogression was taking place exactly at a time number of countries in East Asia, the so-called Asian tigers, were shooting up. Africa was shooting down. And that was directed by the state. And they did not listen to the World Bank and the IMF and the Western world. They did their homework. And China is the last model to look at today. Here's a map, and I have a few maps, and I will go very quickly here. Is the resources of the world. If you look at the map of Africa, there are hardly any industrial systems. Okay? All of them are producing primary products. Whether it's the Horn, where it's sort of food and beverage and things of that, whether it's in Southern Africa where you have minerals, or oil in the sort of a dark blue sector, and so on and so forth. The two green big giants is the People's Republic of China and the United States, with a bit of Canada, Brazil, and few others. That's where the heart of Department 1 of the economy of the world lies. Okay? Africa doesn't have any grounding in that. And as long as you have any grounding in that sector, you are not going to go anywhere. So what's the African problem in a nutshell? A political elite that lacks legitimacy and credibility to lead. Number two, a state that's almost walking blind, visionless. Okay?
too weak to chart a new course and incapable to act on collective continental issues. An economy that has failed to provide productive jobs and living wages for the majority. A fragmented continent is what we have, okay? And deep skills deficit. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine is building an apartment complex in Nairobi. Just guess who is building it? The Chinese are building it. An apartment complex. We can't do it any longer. Okay? That's what we are talking about. So, and finally, enormous underused natural resources. Enormous. That's the nutshell. Okay, tangible glimpses of the problem. Here it is. Thailand has 10% of Saharan African population. 10%, 64 million people. But they export more agricultural commodities than all of sub-Saharan Africa included. Imagine this. One country, which is 10% of Africa's population, produces more agricultural exports than the entire continent. That's the problem. Nigeria, in contrast, used to produce 65% of West African tomatoes, if I can give you a tangible example. Okay? Now it's the largest importer of tomato paste from China and Italy. And they have the land, they have the climate, they have the water, they have the energy. They just can't produce it. Africans, we just can't do it. Okay? By contrast, $50 billion worth of food is imported into the continent. So, if we have huge arable land, why can't we produce the food our people need, is the question. Here is the potential now. Population is a double-edged sword, okay? So it's both a liability because you have to feed it and clothe it and what have you, but it's also a potential market. So it's a double-edged sword. Waa muddo laba af la waaye. Dhinacna way kugu dilaysaa, dhinacna way kugu dhisi karaysaa. Okay. Currently, that population is a burden. Where there used to be one person, now there are 4 people. In 20 years, there will be 8 people. That require food, education, health, and all kinds of things. So the potential is huge in terms of market, in terms of skills. But will we be able to recognize and realize? That's the question. Here's the population. You can't see it properly from this side. In 1950, the African population was 228 million. 70 years later, it's 1.3 billion people. Has the productive capacity of the continent matched that? Of course not. So the higher the population without increased skills, without increased productivity, it means impoverishment. That's what it means. Here's another map, if you like, diagram of that population pyramid of the continent by age. 67% of the African people by the year 2020, 67%, almost 70% will be younger than 30 years of age. Okay? That's the strength of the economy. Are they trained? Are they skilled? The answer is not quite so. So literacy and skills is both a liability and an asset. If you lack it, it's a liability. If you have it, it's an asset. If you look at this map very quickly, the lighter colors are where there is illiteracy. Africa is a black hole in there as well. Here's another. It's the children who are in school age who are not in school. Africa looms large again here. This is the potential, but it's currently a problem. Here's higher education. Africa is again lacking almost across the board compared to other people in other continents. Here's another map of the higher education skills that I was talking about. Again, much of Africa is below 7 years of training, while the Americans and the Canadians and the Europeans and others are over 12 years. Okay? So we have the people, but we are not turning them into productive skills. Here is South Africa, one of the leading economies in the continent. Out of the 100 students who enter school in grade 1 will graduate from college or university. That's the problem. It should be at least 25 to 30% to be able to become competitive in the globe. And that's the best the continent has to offer. This thing is pretty slow. It's not responding. Energy, let me just go very quickly here before Afira cuts me off. Here's electric demand. Without energy, electricity, you can't do much. This room will be dark. We won't be able to talk to one another. Okay? Here is Nigeria at the bottom of this graph. Here, at the bottom. Okay? Nigeria has oil, it has sun, it has wind, it has currents. It meets less than 10% of the country's energy. It's a powerhouse, but it's a crippled giant, as a Nigerian author put it. And so Ethiopia is worse, Tanzania worse, Kenya, I mean, on and on and on. Without energy, the kids cannot learn, machines cannot run. Here is hydroelectric potential. Angola and Cameroon, take for example, they have a capacity to produce 18,000 or 20,000 kilowatts out of hydroelectric systems. They are only realizing 500 or 700 or 3 to 4%. So the natural resources exist that can be tapped, but we are not doing it. Here are the rivers, the Nile, the Niger, Senegal, Congo, Zambezi, and the Orange, that energy should be coming from. Here are some of the plants. So there are quite a few hydroelectric plants, but we need to scale them up. This thing. Solar energy is another. Thank you. Solar energy is another. Where the tropical rainforests exist, there is a low solar energy. Where the deserts are, there is a high solar energy. Where there is clouds and rain, there's hydropower. Where there's dryness and no clouds, there is solar energy. You can lose wherever you go. You can lose in terms of energy. Can we tap it? Is the answer. Is the question. Oil. We only have about 8% of the global oil reserves. The Middle East has 49. So we are not very competitive in that regard. Few countries maybe, but the rest of the continent cannot compete. So wind, again, the same thing. I'm going to move very fast here. This is wind energy. Wind and solar are almost on the same regions of the continent, the darker regions, if you like. Geothermal is another, where Africa has a huge competitive advantage, but again untapped. So here is, what are the solutions? What are the scenarios? And there I conclude. Okay. There is no grand design. Nkrumah used to talk about Africa must unite. There is not going to be a grand design. Europe did not become the EU through a grand design. They started with two sectors, steel and coal. That's the two sectors where they began. Okay, there's a moral to that story that Africans must learn now. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here, among others, is that we need to think about few things that we can put all of our resources as people of the continent, concentrate on that, and engage in a learning process, then ultimately to scale it up. Okay? Oops. What happened? Give me a discount. So think about here, in the area of sort of integration. Maybe we should think of something the Europeans did long time ago, and this country also did, something called joint stock companies, rather than every little country trying to compete with China, or India, or Turkey for that matter. We are not at that stage, but to get to that stage, we have to focus on very few areas across the continent. So for instance, one can think of, in the area of food and agriculture, maybe one major agricultural university that every country in the continent will have a stake and a stock, and where all Africans will be trained rather than go to Iowa State of the United States or somewhere else. That's where we are going to put our money, everybody. The top African students will come there together, and in the process learn to live with one another, learn about their own cultures and their own differences, okay? For instance, here in Turkey, one of the things I have been told is that MPs come from all over many countries, including Somalia, to get treated here. Well, ordinary Somalis don't get treated here. So there's a disjuncture between what the elite's needs are and what the people's needs are, okay? So one could think about, for instance, Eskom is the major sort of energy company in South Africa. Technologically, it's quite sophisticated, but they cannot compete with the Chinese because the Chinese are providing these things cheaper, okay? So can we turn Eskom into a continental company where all the African countries each have an investment and a stake, okay? And therefore, then they can compete because we'll give them preferential sort of privileges that the Chinese don't get in Somalia or in Angola or in Namibia or in Algeria or wherever else, because the company is owned by the continent in total. Okay. Oops. At any rate, let me just conclude because the system is not too friendly tonight or today. Huh? Okay. So construction is another one. I was talking about my friend who's building an apartment in Nairobi, and the contractor is a Chinese company. Kenya can't do that. Somalis can't do that. If you cannot build a 2-story, a 3-story building, what the heck on earth are we going to be able to do? Okay? The only place in the continent where the Chinese companies have been beaten hands down in the area of construction is South Africa, whether it's roads, whether it's hydroelectric dams, or whether it's buildings or factories. There's a lesson for us in South Africa. But the South Africans cannot compete in the rest of the continent if they want to act as their own little bosses too. And so there's an advantage for them to go continental, but the question is, I told them in Pretoria, what is in your economy for us? Okay? So if you want to tap that market, huge market, then we must have a stake, much like you, okay? As long as we are thinking, President Mbeki told me, former President Mbeki told me in a meeting several years ago, he said when we first met with the Chinese, we agreed because Africans are small countries, China is huge, that any African country that's going to negotiate with China will have another country who's bigger than it in terms of technology and what have you, an African that will be a witness to that. He said they don't take advantage of that. Each one of them runs alone to Beijing, and Beijing swallows them then. Okay? So we have to think about that collective continental effort, but in a very strategic and tangible and concrete problems and issues. Whether it's construction or the building of a medical school across the continent, Africans are running to America or India for health. But there are African doctors in America, top cancer research doctors, Nigerians, Ethiopians, Somalis, okay, Nigerians, Cameroonians. They are all over the world. Something like 50,000 surgeons from Africa are working in the United States. Why can't they work? Because, as I remember said, the political elite neither has the vision nor the legitimacy to be able to draw their own people to become productive in our economies. And so these concrete projects, if you like, whether it's in the area of food production, whether it's in the area of construction, whether it's in the area of the medical sciences, and so on and so forth, those concrete projects that are not continental in scope, huge markets, no, that may give us the first leg in the march towards an articulated economy. Thank you for your patience.